In the spring of 1945, the world stood at a precipice. In our timeline, the Allied coalition held firm, however tensely, until the final surrender of Nazi Germany. But history is a fragile thing, built on a series of decisions that seem inevitable only in retrospect. The plan existed not as a serious proposal, but as a chilling contingency on a British staff officer's desk. Its name was Operation Unthinkable. Its objective, to impose upon Russia the will of the United States and the British Empire. In our reality, it was filed away, a historical curiosity. But in this dark alternate history, a single, fateful cable from London to Washington, sent in the tense days following V-Day, sets in motion a chain of events that would plunge the world from a hard-won peace into an even deeper abyss. Operation Unthinkable is about to become a catastrophic reality. The catalyst is not a single event, but a confluence of fears, ambitions, and tragic miscalculations. Winston Churchill, the indomitable British Prime Minister, watches with growing dread as the Soviet juggernaut consolidates its grip on Eastern Europe. The promises of free elections made at Yalta are being broken before the ink is dry. Soviet tanks are not rolling home. They are digging in. For Churchill, the man who had famously declared that he had not become the king's first minister to preside over the dissolution of the British Empire, this new, totalitarian threat from the East is an existential danger. He sees not a wartime ally, but a future adversary whose ideology and power must be checked before it is too late. In a series of increasingly urgent and secret telegrams to President Harry Truman, he argues his case with the force of a prophet. The Iron Curtain is descending, he warns. What remains now is a race for the spoils of Europe. If we do not act now, while our armies are still mobilized and at their peak, we will face a Soviet empire that cannot be dislodged for a century. In Washington, the new President Truman is caught in a maelstrom of conflicting advice. He is inexperienced, suddenly burdened with the mantle of a fallen giant, Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt's more accommodating approach to Stalin is now a thing of the past. Truman's own advisors are split. The military, led by figures like General George Patton, who openly proclaim, "We have been fighting the wrong enemy," agitates for a showdown. They argue that the Red Army, though vast, is exhausted, its supply lines stretched to the breaking point. Its soldiers are desperate to go home. A sharp, powerful thrust, they contend, could roll back the Soviet gains and force Stalin to the bargaining table from a position of Western strength. The State Department and more cautious voices warn of catastrophe. The American public would never accept a new war. The Soviet army was battle-hardened and immense, and such an action would be a moral betrayal of the highest order. For weeks, Truman vacillates, the weight of the world on his shoulders. The tipping point comes from the front lines. A series of violent, localized confrontations between Soviet and American patrols in Germany, which in our timeline were defused, now escalate. A skirmish over a strategically important bridge in Torgau turns deadly, leaving dozens of American and Soviet soldiers dead. Reports, exaggerated by fog of war and the pervasive atmosphere of suspicion, reach Truman's desk as a Soviet probing attack. Simultaneously, intelligence intercepts, later proven to be tragically misinterpreted, suggest a massive, imminent Soviet mobilization westward. It is a perfect storm of fear and aggression. Convinced that Stalin is about to launch his own offensive, and pressured by Churchill's relentless warnings and his own hawkish generals, Truman makes the most fateful decision of the 20th century. He authorizes the implementation of the Western phases of Operation Unthinkable. The order is not for a general invasion of the Soviet Union. It is more nuanced and in many ways more dangerous. It is an order for a show of force designed to compel Soviet withdrawal from Central Europe. The U.S. First and Third Armies are to consolidate their positions and prepare for a limited offensive to adjust the front line to more defensible positions deep in what was to be the Soviet zone. The operation is cloaked in secrecy and deniability. Soldiers are told they are securing disputed territories and ensuring the safe repatriation of prisoners of war. But the Soviet High Command, its intelligence apparatus vast and paranoid, detects the movement immediately. They see the redeployment of American armored divisions, the forward basing of tactical air wings, not as a defensive measure, but as the prelude to the imperialist attack Stalin has always predicted. The order, once given, creates its own irreversible momentum. Commanders on the ground, acting on their new directives, begin to seize key crossroads and communication hubs. They encounter not surrendering Germans, but entrenched, suspicious Soviet units who have received their own orders to stand firm. The tension is a physical presence, a wire pull taut across the heart of Europe. The first shot, when it comes, is almost an afterthought. A nervous machine gunner, a misunderstood signal flare, a territorial challenge that goes wrong. But that single shot, fired in the haze of German dawn, ignites the powder keg. It ripples along the entire contact line, from the Baltic to the Adriatic. Within hours, the greatest alliance in history is shattered. The men who had embraced on the Elbe just weeks before are now digging fighting positions against one another. Operation Unthinkable is no longer a plan in a locked safe. It is the reality of American and British soldiers dying in the fields of Germany, their war not ended, but horrifically transformed. The order has been given, and the world holds its breath, teetering on the brink of a conflict far more terrible than the one it has just survived. In our timeline, the meeting at the Elbe River on April 25, 1945, was a moment of transcendent, if fleeting, hope. Photographs of American GIs from the 69th Infantry Division and soldiers of the Soviet 58th Guards Rifle Division, smiling and clasping hands in the spring sun, became an enduring symbol of the Nazi regime's imminent collapse and the triumph of the Allied cause. It was the culmination of a 4-year, continent-spanning effort, a moment where the shared sacrifice against a common enemy seemed to promise a lasting peace. But in this dark alternate history, the Elbe is not a meeting point. It becomes a tripwire. The handshake does not signal the end of the war in Europe, but the terrifying beginning of a new one. The catalyst is not a single shot, but a cascade of conflicting orders born from the shadowy implementation of Operation Unthinkable. As the first elements of the U.S. First Army and the lead spearheads of Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front make contact, the atmosphere is not one of pure celebration. It is thick with tension, suspicion, and the immense, unspoken weight of what comes next. Junior officers and enlisted men, exhausted and euphoric, share vodka and rations, their interactions genuine. But at the command level, a different drama unfolds. Encrypted signals, based on the new, clandestine directives from Supreme Headquarters, are sent to forward American commanders. They are vague, paranoid, and incendiary. Consolidate positions. Do not cede captured territory. Treat all eastward Soviet advances beyond agreed demarcation lines as potentially hostile. Simultaneously, Soviet political officers, the dreaded NKVD, are flooding into the area. Their orders from Stalin just as uncompromising. Secure all German territory up to the Elbe. Facilitate the immediate establishment of Soviet administrative control. Disarm all German military and paramilitary forces, regardless of in whose zone they are located. The betrayal ignites not with a declaration of war, but with a brutal, localized incident. A battalion of the Waffen-SS, the 11th Nordland Division, recognizing the end of their world, attempt to surrender to the Americans on the western bank of the Elbe, seeing them as the lesser of two evils. The American commander, his orders echoing in his mind, accepts their surrender and interns them in a makeshift POW camp. From the eastern bank, a Soviet NKVD detachment, led by a fanatical commissar, demands the immediate handover of these fascist beasts. The American commander, a weary but principled colonel, refuses, citing the laws of war. A tense standoff ensues. Words are mistranslated. Threats are made. A single, nervous Soviet soldier, misinterpreting a sudden movement, opens fire. In an instant, the riverbank erupts into a storm of machine gun and mortar fire. The images of camaraderie are replaced by the sight of American and Soviet soldiers, who days before had been brothers in arms, now digging fighting positions against each other. The news, distorted by fog of war and propaganda, flashes up the chain of command to both Eisenhower and Stalin. Both sides, preconditioned for suspicion, believe they have been the victims of a premeditated attack. The political and strategic fallout is instantaneous and catastrophic. In Moscow, Stalin, who had always harbored deep-seated paranoia about the West, sees his darkest fears confirmed. He immediately addresses the Stavka, the Soviet High Command. "This is what we expected," he declares, puffing on his pipe. "The imperialists have shown their true face. They conspire with the very fascists we have just defeated. They wish to deny us the fruits of our victory, the security for which 20 million Soviets died." He issues immediate orders for all Soviet forces to transition to a war footing against their former allies. The objective is no longer the defeated Germans, but the Anglo-American invaders. In Washington and at SHAF headquarters, chaos reigns. President Truman, only weeks into his term, is presented with a fait accompli of a shooting war he never authorized. Churchill's aggressive lobbying for unthinkable now seems like a monstrous prophecy come true. There is no time for debate. The military situation on the ground demands a response. Eisenhower, the great coalition builder, is forced to become the coalition breaker. He transmits the code word that sets the contingency plans in motion: crossroads. All along the contact line in Germany, from the Baltic to the Czech border, similar, smaller incidents begin to explode. A confused and terrifying new front line begins to coagulate in the heart of Europe, not along prepared defensive positions, but along the chaotic, ragged seam where the two greatest armies in the world had just met in triumph. The psychological impact on the common soldier is devastating. The men who had fought their way from Normandy and Stalingrad, who had seen their friends die to defeat the Nazi beast, now found themselves ordered to kill the men who had shared that same hellish journey from the opposite direction. The moral whiplash destroys unit cohesion and morale on both sides. For the American soldier, the Soviet soldier is no longer the brave Ivan who broke the back of the Wehrmacht, but a faceless, relentless red horde. For the Soviet soldier, the American is no longer the generous ally who supplied the trucks and spam, but a treacherous capitalist who is allied with the Nazis to continue the war against the motherland. The broken alliance is now complete. The trust painstakingly built over years of correspondence, summits, and lend-lease is shattered in a single, bloody afternoon on the banks of the Elbe. The war against Germany is over. The war for Europe has just begun. With the shocking crack of gunfire along the Elbe, the entire strategic paradigm in Europe flipped instantaneously. The carefully negotiated zones of occupation delineated at Yalta became irrelevant scraps of paper. The shared goal of denazification and pacification vanished, replaced by a single, desperate objective: seize the vital centers of what remained of German power before the other side could. The war was no longer about ideology or vengeance against the Nazis. It was a naked, brutal land grab. And at the heart of this mad scramble lay the greatest prize of all, the Ruhr Valley. The industrial heart of the former Third Reich, with its sprawling factories, coal mines, and intact skilled workforce, was now the key to victory in this new, unthinkable conflict. The initial hours were a scene of surreal chaos. Allied and Soviet commanders who had, just days before, coordinated artillery barges and shared intelligence on German dispositions, now found themselves frantically retasking their units. Divisions that had been mopping up scattered German resistance were now ordered to wheel about and advance, not to liberate, but to occupy. The front line was a tangled, amorphous mess. In some sectors, American and Soviet patrols, not yet aware of the high-level breakdown, continued to cooperate, even as their headquarters were actively planning operations against one another. This confusion created a series of deadly, islands, where units were suddenly cut off and surrounded by their new enemy. A regiment of the U.S. 2nd Armored Division, pushing east to secure a bridgehead, found itself isolated when Soviet T-34s of the 3rd Guards Tank Army swept in behind them, severing their supply lines. The battle for Europe was now a battle of encirclement and counter-encirclement, fought with armies that were exhausted, overextended, and psychologically disoriented. The race for the Ruhr became the central focus of Western strategy. Eisenhower and his generals understood with chilling clarity that whoever controlled the Ruhr's industrial capacity could sustain a prolonged war. The factories of Essen, Dortmund, and Bochum could be repurposed to build tanks, artillery, and ammunition. The coal mines would fuel the war machine. The immediate challenge was twofold: secure the territory physically and secure the loyalty of the German scientists, engineers, and military leaders within it. This led to one of the most morally jarring transformations of the entire conflict. The defeated Wehrmacht, from common soldiers to high-ranking generals, ceased to be prisoners and became assets. Operation Paperclip, which in our timeline was a post-war intelligence effort, was launched in this reality as an urgent, frontline combat operation. U.S. Army T-Force units, accompanied by OSS agents, were no longer just seizing documents. They were seizing people. Their mission was to race into research facilities, corporate headquarters, and even the homes of scientists like Wernher von Braun and his V2 team, and evacuate them to the west before the Soviets could capture or kill them. Simultaneously, a grim and unpublicized negotiation began between American intelligence officers and captured German commanders like Albert Kesselring. The offer was stark: cooperate, and your men will be fed, your officers treated with respect, and your knowledge used to fight the Bolsheviks. Refuse, and you'll be handed over to the Soviets. For many German officers, who feared Soviet vengeance above all else, the choice was simple. Scattered Waffen-SS and Wehrmacht units, still armed and dangerous, were suddenly offered amnesty in exchange for their immediate service as local auxiliary forces. The enemy of yesterday was becoming the militia of today. The Soviet response was equally swift and ruthless. Stalin's orders to his marshals, Zhukov, Konev, and Rokossovsky, were simple: take everything west of the Elbe. Spare nothing. The Red Army, a force honed by 4 years of brutal offensive warfare, shifted gears with terrifying efficiency. Their primary objective was to plunge deep into the heart of Germany, bypassing American strongpoints where possible, to seize the northern German ports and cut off the Ruhr from reinforcement by sea. The Soviet advance was not the methodical, phased occupation of our history. It was a headlong, violent dash. They showed none of the restraint that had characterized their meeting with the Americans. Towns and villages that hesitated to surrender were subjected to the same brutal treatment as German towns in 1944 to 45. The Soviet war machine ran on plunder and momentum, and now was directed squarely at their former allies. The human cost of this scramble fell upon the German civilian population, caught in a nightmare within a nightmare. The columns of refugees, already fleeing the wrath of the Red Army, now found themselves trapped between two new, warring giants. Roads became killing zones as American P-47 Thunderbolts and Soviet Il-2 Sturmovix, aircraft that had once cooperated in the skies over Germany, now dueled for air superiority, strafing anything that moved below. The nascent structures of Allied military government collapsed. There was no time for food distribution, disease control, or establishing order. Lawlessness reigned. The race for the Ruhr was not a clean, clinical military operation. It was a violent, chaotic free-for-all that shattered the last remnants of civilized order in Central Europe, turning the cradle of German industry into a bloody prize fought over by the two exhausted, yet still mighty, armies it had once fueled. The concept of a front line, in the traditional sense, had ceased to exist. It was not a trench system or a clearly defined boundary on a map. The new front line was a jagged, pulsating wound running through the heart of Germany's cities, a nightmarish landscape of urban savagery that made Stalingrad looked like a structured battle. The race for the Ruhr had devolved into a brutal stalemate, and the focus of the conflict shifted to the ultimate symbolic prize, Berlin. The city, already shattered by the final battle against the Nazis, now became the epicenter of a new, even more senseless slaughter. The rubble of the Third Reich became the fortifications for the Third World War. The battle for Berlin was not a single siege, but 1,000 simultaneous, desperate firefights. The Soviet Union held the eastern sectors, having paid for them with oceans of blood in April. The Western Allies, primarily American and British forces, had pushed into the western sectors from their bridgeheads. The meeting point was no longer at the Elbe, but along the Landwehr Canal, through the shell-pocked expanse of the Tiergarten and the shattered corridors of the Reichstag itself. The fighting was characterized by a new, terrifying intimacy. It was not Americans versus Soviets in an open field. It was a platoon of paratroopers from the 101st Airborne, fortified in the skeleton of the Anhalter Bahnhof, trading fire with a company of Soviet guardsmen dug in among the ruins of the Potsdamer Platz. It was a British Churchill tank, its hull scraped clean of German markings, dueling with a Soviet IS-2 from a range of 200 meters, their high explosive shells bringing down entire facades of already damaged buildings on the combatants below. The tactical reality was a logistician's hell and an infantryman's purgatory. Supply lines were non-existent. Ammunition and food had to be flown in by daring Dakota pilots, landing on improvised airstrips under constant artillery fire, or dropped by parachute into shrinking perimeters. There was no rear area. Soviet snipers, the legendary masters of Stalingrad, found a new hunter's paradise. They nested in the skeletons of bombed-out churches and office blocks, their targets no longer German soldiers, but American officers and British radio men. In response, U.S. Army Rangers launched relentless counter-sniper and raiding operations, fighting for control of a single building floor by floor, room by room. The city was a labyrinth of death, where every pile of rubble could conceal a machine gun nest, every cellar could be booby-trapped, and every street corner could erupt in a close-quarter battle with submachine guns and grenades. Amid this chaos, the most bizarre and morally complex element of the conflict flourished: the integration of the defeated German forces. The ad hoc collaborations of the Ruhr were now formalized into essential combat partnerships. The German knowledge of the city's layout, its sewer systems, and its strong points became a priceless asset for the Western Allies. Waffen-SS veterans, their uniforms often discarded for a mix of American and German gear, fought with a desperate ferocity. They were not fighting for victory in any grand sense, but for sheer survival and a hatred for the Bolsheviks that eclipsed even their defeat by the Americans. A German sergeant who had fought in the ruins of Stalingrad in 1942 could now lead a U.S. infantry squad through a connecting cellar to outflank a Soviet position. This created impossible moral quandaries for the common Allied soldier. The man sharing your foxhole, the one who just saved your life with a well-thrown grenade, was the same ideological fanatic you had been trying to kill just months before. The enemy was no longer easily identifiable. The lines between ally, enemy, and war criminal had been irrevocably blurred. The Soviet war machine, for its part, adapted its brutal urban warfare doctrine to this new enemy. They did not distinguish between the Americans and the Nazis. To the average Soviet soldier, they were all fascists now. The same tactics used to crush German resistance in the city were employed anew. Massive artillery barges from the Katyusha rocket launchers, followed by waves of infantry supported by tanks used as direct-fire assault guns. The political officers drove their men with the same relentless pressure, framing the battle as the final, necessary struggle against the capitalist invaders who had betrayed the socialist cause. The fighting was devoid of the chivalry that had occasionally characterized the Western Front. Prisoners were rarely taken on either side. The battle was one of annihilation, fought with a cold, grinding hatred that surpassed even the fervor of the ideological war against Hitler. The city of Berlin, and indeed all of central Germany, became a vast, open-air grave. The cultural and historical landmarks of centuries were pulverized into dust by the renewed, concentrated firepower of two modern armies. Civilian life, what little remained, was extinguished. Those who had survived Hitler's regime and the initial Soviet storm now perished in the crossfire, succumbed to disease, or starved in the cellars. The new front lines were not a military formation. They were the physical manifestation of a world order collapsing into absolute nihilism. It was a battle with no clear objective beyond killing the other side. A fight for ruins, waged by exhausted armies in a landscape of the dead, all under the ominous, unspoken shadow of a weapon that had yet to be unleashed. The war had reached a stalemate of pure, unadulterated destruction. The stalemate in the rubble of Berlin and the bloody stalemate across the German plains presented President Harry Truman with an impossible choice. The initial, headlong rush of Operation Unthinkable had bogged down into a nightmare of attrition. Casualty reports from Europe were arriving at the Pentagon at a rate that dwarfed the worst days of the Battle of the Bulge. The American public, which had reluctantly accepted the fight against the Soviets as a necessary evil after the betrayal on the Elbe, was now growing weary and horrified by the prospect of an endless, bloody quagmire. The Soviet war machine, though battered, showed no signs of political collapse. Its reserves of manpower, while not infinite, were vastly deeper than those of the United States. In the Situation Room in Washington, the maps showed a static, grinding front. The war could not be won conventionally without a mobilization that would bankrupt the nation and cost millions of American lives. It was in this climate of desperation that the Manhattan Project, the best-kept secret of the war, was thrust from theoretical possibility to central strategic reality. The news was delivered to Truman not as a promise of salvation, but as a weapon of absolute, terrifying power. Robert Oppenheimer, the gaunt, intellectually tortured scientific director of Los Alamos, was summoned to the White House. In a secure briefing, he laid out the facts for the president and a select group of military advisors. The gadget worked. The Trinity test in a New Mexico desert had been a success beyond their most fevered imaginations. They now possessed a single, operational atomic bomb, with a second ready within weeks. The yield was equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT. It could, with a single aircraft and a single bomb, annihilate an entire city. The room fell into a stunned silence. For the generals, it was a potential war-winning miracle. For Truman, it was a burden no world leader had ever been forced to bear. Oppenheimer, however, presented not just a weapon, but a dilemma. He argued with a physicist's cold logic and a humanist's desperate passion. Using the bomb on a European city, whether Soviet-occupied or within the USSR itself, would not be a tactical strike. It would be an act of mass murder on an unprecedented scale. It would kill tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of civilians in an instant. It would poison the land for generations. It would, he warned, not end the war, but begin a new and more terrible chapter in human history. Mr. President, he is reported to have said, his voice trembling, we have become the destroyers of worlds. If we use this weapon, we cross a threshold from which there is no return. We will have established for all time that the mass extermination of civilian populations is a legitimate tool of warfare. He pleaded for a demonstration, detonate the bomb on an uninhabited island in front of Soviet observers to show its power and force in negotiation. The military and political advisors, led by figures like General Curtis LeMay, scoffed at this notion. A demonstration was a pointless gamble. What if it failed to detonate properly? What if the Soviets, seeing its power, simply called the bluff and accelerated their own program, all while continuing their ground offensive? The only language Stalin understood, they argued, was force. The bomb had to be used not as a warning, but as a decisive, war-ending blow. The target had to be of such immense strategic and psychological value that its destruction would shatter the Soviet will to fight. They presented a short list: Moscow, Leningrad, or a major concentration of Soviet forces, such as the logistical hub of Poznan in Poland, which was funneling the entire Soviet war effort towards the front. Truman was trapped. He faced the prospect of ordering the deaths of hundreds of thousands to potentially save millions of American soldiers. He also faced the grim reality that if he did not use the bomb and the Soviet Union developed its own first, the consequences for the United States and the world would be unthinkable. The decision was his alone. In the end, the weight of immediate military necessity crushed Oppenheimer's ethical appeals. A demonstration was deemed too risky. The bomb would be used as a weapon of war, but the target was chosen with a chilling, calculated nuance. It would not be Moscow. Destroying the heart of the Soviet government would create chaos, but it might also galvanize a partisan resistance across the vast country. It would not be a city deep in Russia, which would be seen as an act of pure annihilation. The target selected was a city that was both a massive military asset and a powerful political symbol, located in the newly contested territories of Eastern Europe. The order was drafted, encoded, and sent. The 509th Composite Group, stationed on Tinian Island, was placed on highest alert. The ultimatum to Stalin was not delivered through diplomats. It was to be delivered by a single B-29 superfortress, its bay doors opening over a city whose name would soon be etched in the annals of infamy. The world held its breath, teetering on the brink of the atomic age, born not in a fight against fascism, but in a desperate bid to end a war between former allies. Oppenheimer's dilemma had been resolved by the logic of total war, and the shadow of the mushroom cloud now fell over all of humanity. The atomic bomb that detonated over the Soviet military command center at Poznan did not end the war. It transfigured it. The initial, incandescent flash that vaporized the heart of the city and its 50,000 inhabitants, military and civilian alike, did not produce a Soviet surrender. Instead, it produced a silence more terrifying than any declaration of war. The front lines in Germany froze solid. The gunfire in the ruins of Berlin sputtered and died. For 3 days, the world waited for the Soviet response, expecting a final, suicidal lunge west or the appearance of a Soviet atomic bomb over London or Paris. Neither came. Stalin, from a heavily fortified bunker deep in the Urals, issued a single, cryptic broadcast. He did not mention the bomb. He did not mention the Americans. He declared that the great patriotic war against imperialist aggression had entered a new, permanent phase. The hot war was over. The permanent Cold War had begun. The immediate geopolitical landscape was one of fractured, terrified isolation. There was no V-Day celebration. There was only a grim, exhausted armistice signed in a neutral Swiss city, establishing not peace, but a cessation of hostilities. The document created the demilitarized zone of Central Europe, DMZ, a 100-mile-wide scar running from the Baltic coast to the Austrian Alps, littered with ruins, unexploded ordnance, and the bones of the unburied dead. Berlin, what was left of it, was declared an open city, but no one returned. It was a radioactive, contested ghost town, a monument to the folly of 1945. Europe was effectively bifurcated, not by ideology alone, but by a raw, visceral fear. Western Europe, utterly dependent on the United States for its survival, became the Allied Security Protectorate, a collection of client states with limited sovereignty, their economies and foreign policies entirely subordinated to Washington's command. Eastern Europe was not liberated. It was absorbed into a fortress-like Soviet defense bloc, sealed off behind a new, more impenetrable Iron Curtain, its population subjected to a level of internal surveillance and control that made the Stalinism of the 1930s seem mild. The nuclear arms race began not as a competition, but as a frantic, desperate sprint for survival. The Soviet Union, humiliated and scarred by Poznan, poured every resource into its own atomic program. Espionage was no longer a subtle game. It was a total war of intelligence. In 1947, the USSR detonated its first atomic device, not in a remote test site, but in a public demonstration over the remains of a captured German division in Poland, a message of terrifying resolve. The United States responded by developing the hydrogen bomb. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD, was not a theory. It was the foundational principle of global politics. Both superpowers maintained vast arsenals on a permanent hair-trigger alert. A single misread radar signal, a flock of geese, a malfunctioning computer chip. Any of these could trigger the end of human civilization. The entire planet lived under a sword of Damocles that made the terror of the world wars seem like a passing storm. This was a permanent climate of existential dread. Society and culture were warped by this perpetual state of siege. In the United States, the Red Scare was not a temporary hysteria. It was the official state religion. Loyalty oaths were mandatory for all citizens. Dissent was not just unpatriotic, it was treason, punishable by indefinite detention. A sprawling, permanent military-industrial complex became the nation's largest employer and the center of its economy. Suburbia was designed around fallout shelters. Schoolchildren practiced duck and cover drills not as a formality, but with the grim seriousness of a generation that knew the flash could come at any moment. In the Soviet Union, the state-controlled media preached a gospel of relentless vigilance against the American fascists. The entire society was militarized, its economy dedicated solely to defense and heavy industry. Consumer goods were a distant memory. The world was locked in a stasis of preparation for a war that everyone knew could never be fought, a peace that was no peace at all. The century that followed was not one of progress, but of paranoid stagnation. Space exploration was militarized from its inception. The first satellites were not for science, but for reconnaissance and, ominously, as potential orbital weapons platforms. The moon landing, when it finally happened, was conducted by U.S. Marines who planted a flag next to a permanently manned laser tracking station. International cooperation was non-existent. The United Nations collapsed, unable to function with two utterly hostile, armed camps. Global trade was reduced to a trickle between blocs. Technology advanced, but in a narrow, militarized corridor. Cybernetics, computing, and telecommunications were all developed for command, control, and surveillance. The permanent Cold War created a world where the bright promise of the post-war era was extinguished before it could even dawn. There was no rebuilding, no reconciliation, no hope for a unified future. There was only the long, grim twilight of a conflict that had no end. A century of shadow where humanity, having glimpsed the tools of its own annihilation in 1945, chose to keep them perpetually sharpened and aimed at its own heart. The world of 2045 was not the futuristic utopia dreamed of before the wars. It was a heavily armed, deeply traumatized planet, forever frozen in the terrifying moment the first atomic bomb was used not to end a world war, but to start a cold one that would never, ever end.